Hello, everybody. Welcome to podcast number 5 of This Week in Innovation. I'm your host, Jeff Roster, former Gartner and IHL retail sector analyst, along with my co-host, Brian Sathianathan, co-founder of Iterate.ai. Today, we're talking about the 5 forces of innovation, and those are number 1, AI, number 2, the Internet of Things, number 3, blockchain, 4 is startups, and 5 is data. And we spend the whole pod talking about how all those 5 forces, all those technologies and strategies are impacting the retail sector and certainly the startup community serving the retail sector. I think it was a pretty interesting conversation, and it will definitely set the stage for many, many future conversations. So give it a listen. Hey, Brian, good to catch up with you. So I hear we're going to be talking about some interesting innovation ideas or philosophies in retail. Why don't you kick us off what you're thinking?
Yeah, great, Jeff. Glad to be here. Today, I'm also, glad to have colleagues, Dave Jenkins, Vice President of Marketing at Iterate.ai, as well as Solomon Ray, Director of Innovation at Iterate.ai as well. So I invited them as well, Jeff, to talk today, give a better understanding about this new concept we're going to be talking about called the 5 forces of innovation.
Interesting.
The 5 forces of innovation, but at a high level, 5 forces of innovation is this basically AI, blockchain, data, startups, and IoT. Those 5 forces of innovation. And
so are those individual forces, Brian, or are those all kind of jumbled together?
No, they are individual distinct. They're individual distinct forces. We are seeing them all throughout the industry. Some would say that these forces are technologies. But the reason that in our podcast we are calling them as forces is because they're across every organization. They're across every department within every organization. Jeff, you will remember this. You did a lot of work during the internet boom time. There was one force every retail leader had to work with, which was internet. I'm sure you remember this too, right? From the old days, from backcountry and other stuff.
I'm old enough to remember when there was a debate whether Barnes & Noble should buy Amazon. I was at Gartner when that was a legitimate debate.
Yeah, but what's interesting though, Jeff, is that at that time, leaders, like you, Dave, and others have to deal with one force, just one force. That was the force of the internet, right? How do I take my current business and put it on the internet? But today, leaders have to deal with 5, 6, 10, 12 forces, and all of them coming at them at the exact same time. Think about the period from 97, 96 to 2007, 2010, the span of almost 10 years. It took them that long to get to the internet. And even today, digital is still, there is a big struggle for digital, to get digital. And we fast forward 20, 25 years later, we've almost got it. And of course, there are winners like Amazon, all the bigger players, but it took a lot of time. So imagine how long of a time it will take for us to combat these 5 forces. So I just want to put that in perspective.
So Brian, what about something like digital payments, robots, social commerce that we've already done a couple of podcasts on? Where do those fit in those 5 forces?
They are use cases or even like subsections within the 5 forces, right? Robotics, for instance, go into the AI, the autonomous as well as advanced use cases within AI. Same thing with payments and same thing with things like recommendations, which is a very early force within the AI where one can start experimenting with recommendation systems. And that will be in a very easy way to get into the AI space.
Interesting. So why don't we drill down? And what we're going to do, folks, is we're just going to do a quick overview of these 5 forces. And Brian and I and Dave and probably a whole lot of other startups will spend probably the rest of our lives drilling in detail and examples of each one of these. But we wanted to start off with just giving an overview. So let's start to take force number 1, AI. Now, in getting ready for this, I know you have some numbers. I just was also doing my research because I'm an analyst, and I will go to my old friends at IDC, which is shocking for a former Gartner analyst to be using that. But since I'm now neutral, I get to use whatever resources are available. And Brian, they just published a piece of February 23rd, 2021, worldwide revenue for artificial intelligence, including software, hardware, and services, are forecast to grow at 16.4% year over year in 2021 to $327.5 billion, according to their latest release. By 2024, the market is expected to break the $500 billion mark with a 5-year compound annual growth rate of 17.5, total revenues of 554. So a massive number. Now, that's worldwide, and that's all. So retail would be, I don't know, probably 10, 15% of that number, which is still a massive number. So that being said, what do you see, Brian? Do you buy that market size? What does that look like for retail? Unpack what that means for us in this industry.
Great question, Jeff, because I think what happens is that in a growing and a blossoming industry at a rapid pace, it's very hard to predict numbers. I think it's funny because I think in a few podcasts before, the data that I looked at showed 126 billion, the same ID, it was an IDC data, I think, $126 billion worth of AI sales, right? Just software only AI sales, which doesn't include autonomous and all that, vehicles and all that stuff. But then now we see the 327 billion number. And also we see the prediction that it'll go up to a 500 billion number. What's interesting is I think the market is so large and it's across every industry vertical and every department. I'm going to do a crazy prediction. I think in the next 5 to 6 years, the AI software sales market would not be 500 billion, but it would be $1 trillion.
When I'm looking at these kinds of numbers, I've lived with them for 20 years and I've sweated over this. And that's what's cool where we're at right now. I don't know that you and I really care whether it's 327, $1 trillion, or 100 billion. Anything over a couple of million is a pretty big number to me. When I look at these numbers, and I agree with you, just doing the work on this, the numbers are all over the place. But the key is they're all massive numbers. And what's the difference between 327 or 500? It's a massive number. And then I look at that from a retail perspective, as always, because everything comes back from me to retail. If there's that much money being spent in this industry, what's the ramifications for people using that? And maybe more importantly, for any of those retailers that are not taking a peek at this. And so I guess that's where you come in. What are you seeing? What are you working with? What new job descriptions are coming about with all this money being spent? What do retailers need to be thinking about at this, literally today? What's their takeaway from this conversation today?
That's a great question, Jeff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to defer this question to Dave and to Solomon, right? Gentlemen, as what you are seeing today, based on what we see at Iterate as well as what we see outside talking to many folks, what are you guys seeing? Dave, do you want to take that first and maybe Solomon next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I lead a team and we look at startups all day long on behalf of our clients. And we certainly look at traditionally, we've been looking at MarTech, marketing technology providers, but that is expanding out. And Jeff, to bring it back to retail, I agree. As far as like interesting job descriptions, I saw one the other day, and this was a chain retailer. I don't remember if it was Starbucks or some other coffee store, but they were looking for a GIS data scientist. GIS is the Geographic Information System. So no, it's like a mapping professional, to which I'm thinking, how would that have anything to do with anything? But certainly all these companies are into big data and they're trying to make the right decisions on even just basics on which side of the street should we put our store. And as far as any sort of point solution that can come up with and leverage an AI tool, and there are many commonly available AI engines out there, it just takes a couple of people, one of them smart enough to tap into that engine and then come up with some perceived inefficiency in the market and say, wait, we can use AI to solve that inefficiency. And it's not just MarTech anymore. It's now in the physical space. It's in the planning space. It's in the entire supply chain space. This is a blanket statement, but AI can be applied to just about anything. Even something as gardening. There's that robot that will walk up and down your garden and whack the weeds for you because it now has vision built in. It can determine the difference between a tomato plant and a dandelion.
So how many startups do you think AI startups are out there? Dave, do you have a sense?
Yes. That many, yes. I don't know. It's hard to say. We have a database of, right now, we're tracking 1.5 million startups. Of those, how many are AI? I don't know. But
I do have some numbers, Dave.
Yeah, Brian, do you have numbers around that as a share?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So based on the tracking, what we are seeing is there has been, in the last 5 years, there has been 10,004 startups in the AI space, right? So this is collaborative tracking between what we see on the Iterate platform as well as what we see. Like just what Dave said, you can use AI for just about anything.
Interesting. I'm still trying to get over that 1.5 million startup number. That's wow. I would have been off by.
Well, yeah, no, I'm sorry. Let me be clear. What we're doing is what I'm saying is that we have a database that we're specifically tracking now. Though not all of those are AI, but those.
No,
are
I get it. Total
startups.
1.5 million startups. Just that's a massive number.
That is a massive number, and how many of them will survive past a year? That's standard 90-10 rule. Maybe it's only just 1% or 2%.
We typically see around in the 30+% attrition. So you could sort of mortality, right? So you do see companies coming out and going, right? Where I think the 1.5 to 2.5 is the number that you see, especially in the B2B space. If you add a lot of B2C, then that number can be even higher in the 5 to 7 million range.
Because then that would include every lemonade stand. That's just So if we're to look at this as B2B tools, people selling to each other, and if Brian's 10,000 startups is accurate, and that's maybe 1 in 100, but I think that's going to be 1 in 10 in the matter of 2 years.
Gosh,
in other words, if you're a B2B startup and you're not using AI, your days are numbered.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. You can see why we're going to spend a lot of time just on that first force. The second force, Brian, I believe, is the Internet of Things. So let's start with the definition. And for that, I always like to go to my old friends at Gartner. Their definition of the Internet of Things is a network of physical objects that contain embedded technology to communicate to communicate and sense or interact with their internal states or their external environment. Is that a good working definition for what we're talking about when we talk about Internet of Things?
I think it sounds fancy.
Do I take that as a compliment or is that negative? We like to make things pretty.
No, I'll just leave it at that as saying it sounds fancy. But I think what happens is that the Internet of Things is actually a very broad, defined system. What I mean by that is anything that is connected to a computer, and that's anything that's connected to the internet, but that's not necessarily a computer or a mobile device. Anything that can be counted as an Internet of Things. So what's interesting now in the modern world is that you see everybody having wearables, right? The amount of all the Apple Watches. You do see lots and lots of sensors in the different industry verticals. Like agriculture is a classic example, right? Where you see a lot of sensors for crop monitoring and crop health and all that stuff in the medical industry. So as you look at these things, it's a very large number, right? There are billions of Internet of Things devices.
Well, I've got a stat from Statista, number of Internet of Things connected devices worldwide from 2019 to 2030. 2020, they say 8.4 billion items are connected, which seems like a massive number until you look at what their forecast for 2030 is, and they're pushing up to 25.44 billion connected devices. Obviously, there's a whole lot of activity that's going to happen in there. When I went around looking for some numbers and trying to get a market size on this, I came across a headline from Fortune Business Insights, and I'll just read the headline, and the headline does it all. Global IoT market to be worth USD $1.4 trillion. That's trillion with a T, by 2027 at 24.9% compound annual growth rate. Demand for real-time insights to spur growth, says Fortune Business Insights. Top players in Internet of Things market are, and you could fill in the blank. Everyone could fill in the blank. Amazon, AT&T, Bosch, Cisco, IBM, Intel, Oracle, Microsoft, and SAP and Siemens. So literally the biggest players in IT are all over this space with a potential market size of 1 trillion. I don't know, Brian, that seems, we already had that conversation on the billions. Now we're into the trillions.
Well, and
the other thing also, I think what's happening, Dave, is that the definition of IoT, like I mentioned before, is very broad, right? So there's a lot of tag along and riding the wave effects that you see in IoT. So if you when all the variables are counted, suddenly the market becomes very big, right? When you count all the disparate pieces of electronics that is captured for agriculture or everything that's in the medical or in the supply chain field, the market becomes actually very big. Because the other thing that also one should notice is that there is quite a lot of capital cost factored into the IoT market because of the sheer amount of hardware involved. So a lot of the IoT market involves capital plus the software and services, connectivity, everything together, compared to AI, which is very much a highly software model and software and system driven market.
So with that kind of money being spent on IoT, as always back to retail, what does that mean for retail? And what should retailers be doing? What are you guys doing? What are you seeing? How are you advising your clients?
See, I think it's interesting for retail because I think in retail, the IoT is still at its earlier stages, except for certain industries like supply chain and others where IoT, there is a need for IoT that is much more pervasive. But I think in the IoT is also being now experimented a lot in stores, within stores, right? When you receive orders, how do you notify people? How do you know, especially with click and collect and curbside type pickup solutions? How do you know? Because one of the problems and confusions in this in the click and collect curbside is when you, from the time you order till the time you pick up, you don't know what exactly is happening, right? The customers are confused. And that's further exacerbated by traditional legacy e-commerce and order management systems, which are not consumer message friendly. So most consumers or shoppers are confused after they place the order. What now? What do I do now? And IoT is a classic way to know. Our customer placed the order, start packing to notify the associates. Or you pull the vehicle into a gas station, or you pull the vehicle into a service center to let the service attendee know the customer just pulled his car right into the service center. So I think IoT has a lot more to go inside retail, but there are a lot of genuine use cases. I think as retailers begin to uncover these use cases, things will begin to unfold. I think there's a lot of opportunities, I think, definitely in the IoT space. One thing, Jeff, at this moment, I also want to ask Solomon, right? Solomon, you've been thinking about IoT in the beauty space as well, right? Like beauty and IoT and connected objects. Tell us about what your high-level thoughts are within a few minutes, yeah.
I'll start with the greater retail landscape. So I'll just share a little bit. A few years ago, I was looking at electric toothbrushes. And then if I spent, I think, $100 more, I could have got a connected toothbrush. And I thought, who cares? Why do I need to monitor this kind of stuff? It was like jokey. So I just got a regular electric toothbrush and I thought that was fine. But then what we do here at Iterate is that we do track these trends, follow a lot of what's going on in the market. And what's really noticeable this year at CES, for example, this year's CES 2021 is all digital. Compared to this year versus last year, a lot of these hardware devices, including those within the beauty space, are more connected, even by the same companies or the same manufacturers. So even a year prior, where Brian and I and some other folks from our team, we were at CES, we talked to a lot of these startups and vendors about their beauty products, and it might be some kind of beauty device that either uses LED technology for skincare, massages your face, that sort of thing. Last year, it would have been something that's a standalone. But what we saw this year is a lot of these products have to be connected. And whether they're connected through some app or the cloud, some AI-powered recommendation, even these large beauty players such as L'Oreal, they've adopted this IoT concept, knowing that like the data that comes from being an IoT device, it's so valuable and it helps them as an organization expand the consumer experience. So I want to go back to Jeff's point about what does this mean for retail? What does a retailer have to do? And I think it just goes back to this kind of Darwinian evolution. If you basically look at what's going on and you have to evolve or else adapt or die. And so we see this very starkly with what was presented at CES. I want to bring up even the point about wearables, where the wearables has grown dramatically. And if you are a retailer or CPG brand and you want to increase customer engagements and you see a particular demographic that's embracing it, for example, for an Apple Watch, we know that from our research that 35% of iPhone users are wearing Apple Watch. And the Apple Watch itself holds 55% of the global wearables market, next being Samsung at 13.9% a share. So there is something like wearables where maybe a large part of the market or demographic would feel like maybe there's not a lot of adoption, but it's growing really, really fast. So then your reaction time to it is like, what are my consumers using this? What do I do about it? How do I build an ecosystem, collect data through it? And especially if I'm building hardware around it, how do I make sure all this stuff is connected?
Oh, interesting. Brian, do we have a sense of how many startups are focused on IoT?
The number is very large, but that's something that we will follow up following in our data from the podcast. Yeah.
So you can also see why we're going to be spending so much time on IoT going forward. The third force is blockchain. And since you love the first Gartner definition, Brian, I'm going to give you another one and see how this stacks up to you. A blockchain is an expanding list of cryptographically signed, irrevocable transactional records shared by all participants in a network. Each record contains a timestamp and reference links to the previous transactions. With this information, anyone with access rights can trace back a transactional event at any point in its history belonging to any participant. A blockchain is one architectural design of a broader concept of distributed ledgers. How does that one stand up for you, Brian? Do you buy it? Do you have a different working definition?
I think it's an accurate definition, but however, it's not the futuristic definition.
Okay.
Let me paint the picture of why I think blockchain is super exciting, right? I think blockchain has a number of values, just from a layman's terms. I think first is using blockchain, they have figured out, or the blockchain systems provide a method of creating distributed security. So you don't have to have a central authority, because the world is moving towards disaggregation. It's all about removing the middleman, right? Just like what Mark Andreessen said, software will eat the world, right? Iterate today, look at us. We are in the business of using software to power the world of innovation. Software creates disaggregation. Software creates disintermediation. So I think blockchain has effectively figured out how to do disaggregation. And look at all the revolution that's happening with something called DeFi, right? Distributed finance. If you Google that, you'll see a lot of content on that topic, and financial institutions are being disrupted significantly. The other value I think they've also figured out is a system of payment for different types of services vendors. So for example, you're using the Ethereum network or using FET or whatever, right? Whatever the capabilities are. You are basically, for the services happens in the Ethereum network, all the way from the miners to the users to the promoters, they all get some sort of reward mechanism. Because that's essentially interesting, because that takes us to the third part of blockchain, beyond the distributed ledger and security and privacy and all these things, to this concept called autonomous operation. What I mean by that is when Ethereum came in, and also all the new subsequent protocols around in the blockchain world, they built the concept of smart contract, right? So this basically enables two different individual computer systems or disparate computer systems to trust each other, not only to trust each other, but to actually to do a transaction. Imagine a world, Jeff, right? Today, look at a startup like Iterate. So we have 62 people. I'm sure there are startups that have more people, but then we have departments, right? Like there is AP, account collection, account processing, billing, all that stuff there. In a futuristic world, companies are going to be run in an autonomous nature. What I mean by that is all the AP functions will be run by smart contracts and blockchain. Legal functions will all be powered through blockchain, right? HR will be powered through blockchain. Some parts of even engineering and R&D will be powered by AI, do a lot of code generations. And just like AWS today, when you buy a server in AWS, you don't talk to them or negotiate price. You click on a button, and then the button will give you calculated hours of usage, and your card is automatically charged. Same thing will happen in the blockchain. So you will end up having autonomous organizations. You can already see this today, right, in the crypto world. If you look at a company like Uniswap is a very interesting company. It's a distributed exchange, right? The company has, I think, 26 people, valued at $23 billion. If you look at a company like Fetch.ai that uses a blockchain protocol to do things like delivery and all these capabilities, right? I think valued at somewhere in the $380 or $90 million. If you look at the whole blockchain crypto world, right? The top cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, is valued over $1 trillion, and the 500th cryptocurrency is valued over $100 million. So you are actually seeing actual real money going towards these things. Some of them may be speculation because as you're going through the S-curve and the value of dissolution and so on, some of them will just die off. But then the others would continue to live, and then you would end up seeing the Amazons of the world build in this ecosystem. You will actually have autonomous operations. And I think that's futuristic. I think that is novel.
So Brian, I just saw an article today. This AI, and that's not blockchain, but it's AI. This AI startup is saving, and this is the headline actually. This AI startup is saving Walmart and other big companies millions by automated negotiations. So the AI is actually, and it goes, the article is actually pretty detailed. I won't spend the time here, definitely maybe down the road. But basically what they've done, what this company does, the startup does, is with the client, in this case, Walmart. So it obviously gets us all attention in retail. They look for pretty straightforward purchasing scenarios, which is quite a bit. And then they can automate that process using AI and machine learning and whatnot. And I thought that was very interesting because of the impacts and whatnot. So we're not talking future. We're really talking today in retail, which always is, you know me, I'm always trying to bring it down. What do I need to worry about today? So what does a retailer need to worry about today related to blockchain? And by the way, we've already done a really good podcast on blockchain. We probably already answered this question, but just for the sake of this conversation, if somebody's just hearing this, what does a retailer need to be thinking about today related to blockchain?
I think a couple of things. First, is because of the GDPR and the CCPA and all these laws, I think it's about user data. Having user data on blockchain, I think, could be a very interesting use case because you can also provide the user the ability to download their data and keep it with themselves. It sounds very altruistic, but at the same time, it's also a very, very cleaner way of interacting with the consumer. If you look at companies like Apple versus Facebook, Apple's taking the approach, we care as a consumer, Mr. Shopper, we care about your privacy. We're going to allow you to be private, and we're going to build all our systems to help you be private. And I think retailers could take that approach. I think it's a form of respect to the consumers, and I think consumers will reciprocate. The other one is rewarding and coupons and all these systems that are currently run through disparate legacy platforms can all be converted to blockchain. A lot of retailers carry so much of reward points in their ledgers and in their financial books, and they figure out how to burn them by giving the consumers magazines. What if these all traded in exchanges, right? The consumer could trade it for something else, and you could create interoperation between several retail networks without even these retailers cooperating on paper, because the blockchain networks would create that. So that's the second one. The other case is basically these efficiencies, like these autonomous operations, like you pointed out, this contract negotiation, right? AP collection, right? Product price negotiations with product brands. All that stuff can be run on blockchain and can be run very efficiently. Then, of course, you have this whole authenticity and provenance, right? It doesn't work in every retail product. Some products it does, like timber or gold or diamonds, and you could enable that. And I think IBM is playing in a big way into that, and we're seeing some use cases, practical use cases out there.
Interesting.
It's highly applicable in luxury.
Definitely to or at least minimize or prevent counterfeiting. If you can use blockchain Ethereum contracts throughout the entire supply chain, as Brian mentions with diamonds, this diamond was tracked from A to B to C to D to E all the way through with a verifiable contractual chain, then okay, good. This is not a conflict diamond.
Just something very similar, like in the luxury space, we see like the whole point of luxury is like it's high value, but you want to be able to authenticate it. And then even in secondary markets, there's that uncertainty. Is this authentic? So something like blockchain is a powerful tool to make sure this is a product that is as advertised. It does have the qualities that is described. So it brings value into something where there is a lot of gray area in that luxury secondary market that such a technology can really refine.
Yeah, I think that's going to be an area we'll definitely be drilling down. I know at least a couple of really interesting case studies. Definitely a lot more coming on blockchain. The fourth force is startups, and I don't have good stats on that, Brian. So unpack for me what you mean by startups as a force for innovation.
So what's really interesting is that as the need for innovation across various areas is increasing, you have to have solution providers or emerging technology providers to address these genuine needs. That's where the startups step in. We saw this inflection point of startups, the number of startups suddenly increasing somewhere around in the 2012-13 timeframe, right? Before that, there was always a very steady state flow. What Dave was talking about, we track 1.4 million startups. I think some in the B2B, probably around 1.5 to 2.5 million startups, probably with about 15-20% mortality rate. What these startups are doing is they are beginning to provide and address the need within retail and as well as other sectors, the individual needs that these large businesses have, right? Because if you look at it, there are two types of startup solutions that are out there. One is what Dave and I call it the point solutions, which are basically startups that address one specific need. I don't know, Jeff, if you looked at the Scott Brinker's diagram, the MarTech diagram. I remember, seeing his presentation, I think several years ago, 2016 or something, at maybe 17. And I think there was like 50 companies that was there in his diagram that actually shows the MarTech startups that are playing or providing marketing technology solutions. And a few years later, that diagram had, I think, 500 or 400 companies in there. That's just in one area. And then the other area that Solomon and I deeply look at is actual infrastructure and platforms and like deep tech type areas. We are seeing significant penetration. So because earlier when retailers purchased solutions, especially large infrastructure solutions, they would always purchase the suite-based solutions like SAP, Salesforce, Oracle, because it's a one-stop operation. Negotiate the contract once, you have a deeper relationship and keep going. But now they have moved to best of breeds, right? They're willing to break their infrastructure up into 100 pieces opposed to 5 pieces and look at solution providers in these breeds who are best of breeds across these areas, which I think is an interesting paradigm shift. So you're also seeing quite a lot of startup and technology penetration in infrastructure as well as back-end core technology as well.
And I think a major driver there is, and again, I would agree, Brian, there has been a major shift over the last 10 years. Major companies, consumers of technology, the B2B market, before, maybe it was oftentimes a server-based solution and it was an application that sat on the local company network, things like that. But now that 98%, I'm just making that number up, but now that almost everything is through the browser, a couple things have happened. One, that means that any sort of technology is now in a unified deliverance system to the end user. And two, all these point solutions where if the company CTO before had to worry about unification of data or making sure that all these apps played together with each other, well, the browser has answered that question for him or for the CTO. So now these point solutions, as long as they work in a browser, they can do anything. That's been very freeing. Yeah, so that's to me that's produced this Cambrian explosion of apps.
Interesting.
I agree. I totally agree. And to that point, what's really interesting is the reason I think this is a very powerful force, a force that you cannot ignore. This is the force that Solomon, myself, and Dave spend a lot of time looking at, is because if you ignore the startup force, it turns out to become the death by 1,000 cuts, right? Because all these startups can actually become disintermediators, right? Or disaggregators of your core business. So that's why it's important to understand and begin to start working with startups. And our entire company, Iterate, is built around it. And if you talk to our customers or our members, they will tell you that in the last couple of years, they've extensively started to leverage these type of technologies. And that has helped them transform their business. We actually have lots and lots of KPI numbers, from conversions to average order increase value in retail, to engagement rates, to faster website loading times, to very back-end metrics like increased loyalty members, increased time in store, increased engagement at the gas station, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. As somebody that's been looking at the vendor landscape in retail for last 23 or 4 years, 3 or 4 years ago, NRF saw startups is a big enough area focus to dedicate a whole floor to. The fourth floor was all startups. And I actually spent a lot of time there this past NRF. That was packed. That was absolutely packed, not just with startups, but with people cramming in there, retailers cramming in there. The Cambrian explosion is a fascinating way to think about that. And it's clearly evidence in the focal point that I see startups getting in the space. Brian, the fifth force that you talk about is data, and that's a pretty big topic. So are we talking about big data, or is it a different kind of data?
This is about data in general, right? It involves big data. It involves small data. It involves data that is created by all of us humans. Just to put that in perspective, in the last 5 years, we've created 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. Every day. And all this data is created in the last 5 years. We've created more data in the last 5 years than the entire human existence ever combined, right? Earlier, even if we could have created some amount of data, but guess what? We didn't have methods to store them, analyze them, and really predict using the data, right? Now we are creating more data. Plus, we also have better methods to harness the data and to really understand the data and make sense out of the data. So that's why data is a very powerful force, right? I think it's another thing that I also want to point out here, apart from the volume and the explosion of data, is that organizations have always had lots and lots of data within their coffers. But the problem with the data that they've had is that it's always locked in silos, right? Data sitting in one department cannot be leveraged by another department, and so on and so forth. With this explosion of data, companies are somewhat forced or even motivated to break out these barriers and break down these barriers and leverage data across. And there are a number of reasons. One is there are tools. There are enough tools that are out there that help you pull data across various places. The other is also that there is AI and ML, the first force we talked about, where you can just blindly point to a bunch of data without having a lot of business rules. And as long as you have some prior outcome, you could train a lot of these AI systems in a supervised manner to come back and do some prediction. So this type of technology combined with the growth of data is a big force. And I think one of the problems, and in fact, we've seen this in the past with the growth of companies like Google and Amazon and so on. It was so interesting when I was building my first company. One of our investors was also an investor in another very hot upcoming search company, which was competing with Google. But they poured a lot of money because they were also prior investors in Google as well. Poured a lot of money in building this next generation search. But guess what? In 3 years, the company completely failed. This search company completely failed. The reason it failed was not the lack of algorithms, but the lack of data. Over time, Google had collected this humongous amount of data, right? So that's why I think data is critical, because great data and a bad algorithm can still create great outcomes, compared to really bad data and a great algorithm can still create very bad outcomes. Interesting. So that's why data is critical, and also the collection and being conscious. And I love this word you use, Jeff, called intentional. I think organizations have to intentionally collect data, even if they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, Brian, that's funny because that phrase comes from a conversation that Vicky Cantrell and I had on a bus ride in Honduras, where we were bemoaning the idea that retail was looked at as a laggard industry. We never believed that, but retail has done themselves no good favors by not bragging about what we've done as an industry. And so we thought we need to start talking about the intentionality of innovation. Let's try to break that out from the labs and retail and really start bragging about it. And I don't know that we're there yet, but we're certainly getting there. Brian, that is a really interesting spin through what I think we're going to spend probably the rest of our careers talking about. So just as a recap, we see 5 forces really driving innovation holistically and certainly in retail. And those are AI, number 1. Number 2, the Internet of Things. Number 3, blockchain. Number 4, startups. And the 5th is data. So what we would like everyone to do is come along in this journey as we go through and unpack these 5 forces, what's happening in the retail sector, what's happening in the startup community. And feel free to interact with all our various sites. Push us on what we're thinking about. Feel free to challenge us and debate. Happy to do that. We are very active on Clubhouse. We're certainly active on YouTube and all the various social media platforms. So with that, Brian, thanks again. And Dave and Solomon, thanks for helping us unpack all this. And see you next time.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank
you.
you, Dev and Solomon. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. For more info, refer to the pod notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us grow. I'm your host, Jeff Roster, analyst at large. If you want to connect, follow us on Twitter at JeffPR or at Brian Sathianathan, or connect with us on LinkedIn. Visit my website at roster.retail.com or Brian's at Iterate.ai. Until next time, stay safe and have a great week.